Hello everyone, and welcome to the Great Grief Gift, Finding Meaning and Purpose After Loss, part of the Good Grief Festival. I'm Liesl Dawson, a senior lecturer at the University of Bristol. While the death of someone we love can shatter our lives, it can also act as a catalyst for change, prompting us to do something active and meaningful, from a new creative project to starting a charity or political campaign. Loss can also increase our compassion and remind us of life's fragility and preciousness. With me today are three amazing people who have created meaning after devastating losses through their creativity, empathy, and activism. Clover Stroud is an author, journalist, and broadcaster. Known for her gripping, vivid prose and searing honesty, she is the author of two powerful and widely acclaimed memoirs, The Wild Other and My Wild and Sleepless Nights. The Right Honourable Stuart Lawrence is a consultant, youth engagement specialist, and public speaker. He is the younger brother of Stephen Lawrence, the British teenager murdered in a racially motivated attack, and he campaigns for racism awareness and devotes time to the promotion of Stephen Lawrence Day on the 22nd of April annually. Finally, Simon Bray is an artist and creative producer. He is well known for his beautiful and moving Loved and Lost project, and he's also the creator of the project Siblings, inspired by the death of his sister. So thank you for coming, panel. It's really lovely to have you here with us today at the Good Grief Festival. I wanted to start really by talking to each of you in turn, and for those of our audience who aren't aware of your work or your story, just saying a little bit about your life and the way that grief has inspired you. I wonder if I could start with Clover. Clover, could you say a bit about your life and how grief has influenced your creativity?
Yes, thank you very much for having me, inviting me to this wonderful event. I had a very happy childhood, but grief came into my life in a very sort of profound and dramatic way when I was 16, because my mother had an accident and she sustained extremely acute brain damage, and she was in a coma for 3 or 4 months, and when she gradually woke up, it was clear that she was completely altered, and she couldn't look after herself, she couldn't walk or talk or feed herself, and she couldn't communicate in any way whatsoever. And we tried to look after her at home. I was 16 at the time, and I was the youngest of 5 children. I was in the first term of my A-levels. But it became clear that Mum had really, really acute brain damage and very high physical and mental health needs. And she spent the next 22 years in a nursing home in this sort of state of kind of life in death, I suppose, death in life. She wasn't there, but she was still alive. And so this kind of traumatic process really imprinted itself into my DNA, I think, because I was 16 at the time. So grief is something that I have, and I'm now 45, I have lived for all of my adult life since mid-adolescence. And I'm very aware of the way that it has, creatively, that it has kind of moulded me and shaped me. I started work as a journalist in my 20s, but I knew that I wanted to write about what happened to Mum. And as I've got older, the griefs, the losses have accumulated. And there have been many more. And I understand more about grief being a way of living, I think, essentially. It's something that becomes who you are, and it certainly informs all my work. The book, The Wild Other, that I wrote, my memoir about what happened to Mum, is about my process of living with her in this state of sort of life and death. And my book on motherhood is kind of about the strangeness of motherhood, and I'm writing my third book about the sister. My sister died in 2019 very suddenly. Although she had breast cancer, she died very quickly. So grief is a huge, huge part of my kind of creative drive. And I really feel that understanding that loss is sort of part of the human condition. It's not a sort of moment where life has gone terribly wrong. It is like being human is understanding loss and processing loss. And I almost feel quite sort of possessive of it. I kind of, I'm quite proud of the losses that I've been through. I'm incredibly proud of the imprints that the people that I have loved and lost have left on my life, and the way that your grief is also a manifestation of love. And it certainly is, for me, it's certainly the way that I have dealt with it is through I think a kind of richer and richer creativity and richer output. And the price that I've paid is very high. I've lost my mother and my sister and many other people that I love very, very much. But there is, something beautiful has come out of that. So that is the way that that grief is it's completely part of me. It's part of my, it's part of everything that I am. It's in my DNA. It's in my bone marrow, and I am proud of it. And I'm proud of the way that it makes me create, I suppose, and makes me write.
That's a really powerful way to put it. And I think what you say about grief being part of you and being integrated in you is, it's also the way of us carrying the people we love with us. I'm interested, before we move on to Stuart, I'm interested just to hear whether you felt there was a period of time you had to wait before you could start writing, or whether you could dive straight in.
Certainly, I think it's a really interesting question. And when my mother had her accident, I was only 16. I didn't know who I was at all really at that point. But I did understand in my 20s that I wanted to write about what was happening to her. And I wanted to write about what was happening to me and how it was changing me. And I knew that something was happening to me that was different from the things that was happening from my contemporaries and my friends who had not yet experienced this kind of loss. But it really wasn't until my late 30s that it was really after Mum died that I could write profoundly, that I could start writing. I'd written about her and what was happening to her in my journalism, but it was after her death that I knew that I had to do some kind of big writing project about what happened to her and about my experience. I owed it to her, I owed it to myself. I needed to to communicate what had happened. And so there definitely was a long period of time that I had gone through. It was part of learning to write, basically. And then I'd been writing for 15 years when I wrote The World Other. When I wrote my motherhood book, which is also, there is a process of loss that goes on with motherhood as well, I was writing it in real time. I just had my 5th baby and I wanted to write, and my eldest child was in a lot of trouble at school, and I wanted to write about being a parent to a mother and a teenager at the same time, and the kind of way that you are stretched and changed, and you lose something of yourself, and you actually lose something of your children all the time. That's part of the process of parenthood. This book that I'm writing now, I started writing immediately after my sister had died, which was at the beginning of lockdown. I started writing it, and I'm just at the end of it now. And I think that there is I'm really interested what other people say about this, but I think there is the thing that the more loss and the more you go through, the more that you've lived with it, the more you understand it. You know that it's the pattern, you can feel it, you can kind of feel the way it's acting within you, and it's a familiar and then a kind of almost a comforting thing as well. And knowing that I can, harness my creativity to that pain is a really important part of my life. But so my answer is that I think my mum, what happened to my mum with this very, very, very long illness was like a training in grief, really. I was grieving for 22 years while she was alive. But when Nell died, because I'd been through all of that, it was actually really important for me to dive into it straight away, to not leave that time, to start creating and doing something kind of active around the grief straight away. And that's been my way of getting through the last year with her death, has been absolutely pouring myself into the writing.
Wow, that sounds amazingly powerful, and I'm going to be really interested to read your next book. And it does say something about the way in which, there might be a state of denial and that, you know, engaging with the grief is when you sort of move past denial.
Yes.
And so in you know, the loss of your sister, in a sense, you didn't have the same level of denial, having been through grief, as you did with your mum, which for lots of reasons, you know, it's understandable wanting to resist that pain, but it's almost as if you could dive into meaning much quicker because you were kind of ready to feel the pain and integrate the experience.
Yes, absolutely. And it felt really important to me to record it. I felt like I needed, so many people said to me after Nell died, I can't begin to I can't begin to imagine your loss. I can't begin to imagine what you're feeling. And many people have said this to me about living with a mother with, you know, acute brain damage for 22 years. I can't begin to imagine. I really wanted to communicate to people, this is what it feels like, or this is what it's felt like for me. This is how strange, how disembodied, how angry, how kind of wild I feel, because sometimes, you know, grief is also an incredible thing. It's an incredible awakening, and I wanted to hold on to that feeling. Because when you look back on emotion, it changes. You know, it has changed when you are trying to communicate emotion from a longer perspective. It's going to be a different thing, and I felt like, you know, I was almost on the ground as a war reporter. I wanted to be in there. I wanted to be in there, reporting exactly what it was feeling like, and that kind of, you know, the opening chapters of the new book are the first few days after Nell's life, and that weird, disembodied, incredibly physical, you know, the sort of loss of self and the feeling of, I felt like an iceberg that was just like melting, and I was becoming something different. And so the immediacy was really important, and in a way, I suppose, yeah, having lived through so much grief in my life, it equipped me, I think, to recognize the feelings quickly, and I feel, you know, privileged in a way, in a strange kind of way. It's a privilege.
Thank you. That's incredibly powerful. Stuart, can I turn to you now, and can you
Yeah.
say a little bit about your life for people who don't know your story? I imagine there's not many people out there, and also the way you've used your grief in your activism.
Sure. I'm Stuart Lawrence. Really lovely to be here again with Good Grief, and to be talking about this, because again, I think it's important that we are able to share our experiences, to give insight, pass on knowledge, tips, guides, if we can, to what people could be experiencing. Because I do believe as well that everyone's grief is quite unique to themselves, and their experience is quite unique to themselves. And there may be commonalities along the way, but it is quite a unique and personal thing. So for me, losing Stephen at 16 as well was a profound effect, because him being my older brother, he was my guide, he was my leader, he was the person that went through different experiences before I did, and then in turn they showed me or told me what those experiences were like. So I felt quite lost for a while. I then shut down for quite a long time in my life. I now realised that I had a sort of emotion of going through, and I'd meet people, not tell them what happened to Stephen. When they found out, you know, I'd always work in cycles of things. So, you know, I finished at 16. I went to college for a year. I left there, didn't keep any friends. I went to another college for 2 years. Went there, never kept any friends. Went to university. It was always this thing about me reinventing myself and leaving behind when people knew or got to know me a bit better. And it's only sort of now that I've got to some sort of reached age of 40 something, and just looking back and understanding the process I went through and the things that I did and the reasons why I behaved the way I did, the reason why I said certain things, is now quite powerful. And I think creatively, I've realised as well that it's a great motion to push you forward. And we talked about activism as well. And I heard recently that, you know, when losing someone through quite a tragic and violent way, then anger is usually the first emotion. And I say to people all the time that I thought that anger would be a wasted emotion to have, but it's a great catalyst to start something. It's only a bad thing if you let it consume you and let it wash over you and that be the only driver in your life. But if you can use the anger that grief gives you to catalyze yourself to start something, and that project then be a way of you releasing yourself and explaining yourself and processing these thoughts and emotions, is a great thing as well. So I've now realized that with that catalyst, we can start things. That could be the push. And that was the push that enabled us as a family to go on and seek justice. And I always say to people all the time, the things that's happened because we lost Stephen weren't things that we set out to do. There's the changes of the law, institutional changes, first reform, all those things were elements and things that happened along the way, but it wasn't the reason why we did them. The reason why we did them was because we were seeking and looking for justice for Stephen, and the sense of people not believing us and understanding where we came from and what we was about as a family was also quite a big driver at the time as well.
That's very powerful. I wonder if you have any memory of how you turned from a state where you were kind of more in denial, where you were running from the pain of what had happened to you and sort of reinventing your life, to the moment where you started using this grief to do, to do something good in the world.
100%. I remember it exactly. It was 9/11. I was working in the Home Office at the time. I was on the minister's floor, which was the only one of those floors that had a TV. And I remember watching these vivid images of like planes going into buildings and people's hysteria. And then afterwards, the days perpetual after that, I started to realize and ask myself, like, what am I actually doing? How am I contributing to life? Life is so precious and so fragile that if I wasn't here tomorrow, what would I be able to say that I've left behind of my mark? What have I done? How have I contributed? How have I tried to make this place a different place? And I realized that, yes, as a civil servant, I could make that change, but it wouldn't be a very visible change. It wouldn't be very tangible. It's so far removed from what people actually realize of what you're doing. So I then realized that teaching may be the best avenue for me to do that. I always had people say to me along my journey in my education that, Stuart, great communicator, the way you explain things, have you ever thought about teaching? And I hadn't, because for me, teaching never came across as a glamorous, exciting, jazzy career. It really didn't seem like that. But once I did start teaching and I did start to realize the impact that you can have on young people, the influence, the knowledge building, the stories that you can share, the experiences that you can share with, especially with young people who may be going through similar things or experiences was an absolutely powerful thing. And I absolutely say to everyone all the time, like the time I had teaching has now helped to shape me going forward to understand that I must now use what's happened to me and communicate in a different way and be able to put the message out a bit further and wider, because it's important for everyone to understand that about that whole thing about the fragility of life and that tomorrow's not promised to no one. So in this day today, how can we make sure that we're maximizing and being the best individuals we possibly can and contributing back to life the best way we can as well?
That's beautiful. That's really amazing. It's interesting that it was, in a way, a kind of big national trauma, grief, loss that almost allowed you to connect back into your own more personal experience of loss. And can I ask, did your own feelings of grief change when you hit this moment?
Yeah, I suppose it's that whole thing about running away. The running away, not accepting the whole thing of I'm okay, it's okay, it's going to be okay, it's going to be all right. That whole mindset. I say to people all the time, like I went to school the next day after Stephen died. I had this motion in my head of I want to know what's happened. Someone out there knows what's happened. I want to know. I must find out. I must pass this information on to my mum, who can pass it on to the police so that we can get this justice that we want. So that was my first notion. And then I realized that I kept on going and I've only stopped. So when 9/11 happened, I took 3 months holiday and then left the civil service and, found my way and moved around. And I worked in Belmarsh prison. I just temped for ages before I went to teaching. And then since I've stopped teaching in 2018, I took a year out then again. And that was really powerful just to have time. I always say to people that grief is one of those things that you need time. And that length of time that people need to get over it is such a piece of string for everyone. Like, how long is that for everyone? So, I remember sort of like 18, 19 saying to my mum, do you know what, before I go to university, I just want to go and do some traveling. She's like, oh no, if you stop now, I don't think you'll continue. You're on a momentum thing, just keep going. I failed my first year at uni because my mindset wasn't ready for that next change. And it wasn't until I failed that first year, came back to London, again, worked 6 days a week, 12-hour shifts to realise that, wow, like life could be like this, to then sort of get me back on that bike of motion again. So I say to people all the time, having time to be able to reflect, to think, to centre yourself, to ground yourself, to understand what you are going through, how it's affecting you. Again, like was just been said, it's almost like that iceberg thing. I do believe that, like, the way that you appear on top to the way that you appear underneath is two different things. It really is.
That's really powerful, and it really sends the message home that, you know, grief will wait for you, that you can't bypass it, you can't get around it, and if you try to run from it, it will still be there. And actually the way to make our lives meaningful and really to find joy is to have to go with it and not resist it, and to make space in your life for grief. And again, Clover's really powerful way of putting it, that grief is this part of her now. It's integrated in who she is, but it's also this incredible force, you know, that makes things happen. That's wonderful. Simon, can I turn to you now, and can you share a little bit about your story and your art?
Sure. Thank you for having me. Yeah, two absolutely remarkable stories from Clover and Stuart. It's amazing to hear. I lost my dad when I was 21. It was in 2009, the end of 2009, and he'd had prostate cancer, which was diagnosed when I was 17. So I find it interesting that, you know, all three of us have had a quite sort of pivotal thing happen to us in that what is such an important time in life. And it's something we're carrying on into our adult lives as well. And then I more recently lost my younger sister. She was 29 in 2018. She had cancer as well. And I think it's interesting we're talking about that sort of that space and that length of time. I was obviously quite young when I lost Dad, and I was in the middle of a degree. I sort of had to get back and sort of finish that the last few months, and I wasn't quite sure sort of where to turn. I had some sort of counselling, but obviously lots of my contemporaries and my peers hadn't been through losing a parent, and it wasn't something that I really knew where to go in terms of having a conversation about it. And a few years later, so probably 2 or 3 years later, I started working, doing photography and working as a photographer. And I wanted to sort of develop a project that meant I could, well, at the time I thought do something nice for other people. So I invited my mum initially to restage an old photograph of her and Dad. And so she found this picture of her and Dad, which was taken just a few days after they were engaged at Top Hill in Winchester. And my inclination was we would go back and I'll get Mum to stand in the same spot and then present those two pictures side by side. So it's a really simple mechanism. You know, photography is very good at demonstrating that passing of time. But obviously in that second image, there was an absence of space where Dad should have been. And it was really kind of quite stark and quite clear from those two images that Dad wasn't there. And that was a really important way for me to acknowledge, I suppose, that he had died, he had gone. It was a very clear way of portraying that to, you know, my friends and family, but then also to a wider audience that's sort of become interested in the project. So I've now worked on about 25 of those stories with strangers, essentially. Lots of people have come to me and asked to take part in the project over the last 7 or 8 years. And as part of that, we also record conversations. And I think the key part for me is it's been a mechanism through which I've been able to talk about my loss and understand more about other people's loss in a very sort of candid way. I think when you're talking to a stranger, there's, you know, you're starting from scratch. You know, there's no sort of, if you're talking with family, there's this understanding that, you know, there's elements of the relationships, but actually if you're talking with somebody who doesn't know anything, you can tell them your version of events and how that made you feel. So having these conversations with all these participants within the project has been a really nice way for me to ask questions and for them to ask me questions and to share our experiences, and almost to sort of legitimize how we've emotionally dealt with things and gone through those sort of waves of emotion and that passing of time. It's a good way to reflect and look back. And, you know, obviously part of the project is returning to a significant location where a photograph was taken. You know, that the going back to that place evokes lots of emotions, and it's a very sensory experience, and the sights and sounds and the smells. And so that sort of feeds into that sense of returning and looking back, almost sort of honouring the person and recalling, you know, what was presumably a happy occasion, a happy day from that original photograph. So it's a very intentional way to sort of access that notion of the time that's passed. And I suppose in terms of me starting the project, it did take a few years for me to sort of find my feet and wait for that sort of initial pain and the shock to subside and think about looking back. But I think I was still full of questions, even if I wasn't quite sure where to ask them. And I think your priorities do shift. I mean, I think there's a notion that you shouldn't really make any big life decisions in the immediacy after grief. But actually, I think as we've talked about, there is this sort of change in perspective. You sort of you're looking for purpose and meaning, and you might want to do, I really wanted to do something to help others. I suddenly, the value of other people suddenly went up, because I suddenly realized that they weren't all going to be here forever. And I think, and as much as I was doing it for everybody else, it was largely for me to help explore my own grief. But so I suppose I did that through finding others and finding people who were willing to have those conversations with me, sort of instigated through the photographs, I suppose.
And that's really interesting. Can you say a little bit also, I mean, like Clover, you've had these two losses, with a bit of time in between them. Would you say your grieving experience has been different with your sister? And can you say a little bit more about the creative project that's come out of that grief?
Yeah, of course. Yeah, I think it was quite different. I mean, I'd obviously learned a huge amount from not only the personal experience of losing Dad, but also the conversations that I had in that preceding time through the project. But naturally through having that experience, you find other people and people ask you about it. Losing my sister was different. She was ill for a far shorter period of time, and so it was more of a shock. She had a young daughter and a husband who tried to sort of make sure that everybody was looked after as best possible and carrying on with that. But I think personally it did frame it in a completely different way. I think in a way I was more naive when Dad passed away, and actually I've come away with even more and larger questions the second time round, in a sort of spiritual sense, I suppose. But in terms of the work, I've relatively quickly, I suppose, invested myself in making a project exploring sibling relationships. So taking photographs of sets of siblings and trying to understand a bit more about the dynamic of the sibling relationships that we have, because it's something that feels quite inherent. Stuart talked about the relationship with Stephen and sort of, you have these. It's different to having a parent. Your siblings might go before you or come after you, and you can guide each other, and you learn a lot, and you have these in jokes and this sort of familial collection, which doesn't necessarily have a hierarchy like you do with parents or other family members, and so trying to show some sense of affection and physical connection through the pictures, and I invited people to take part who sort of knew me and knew the scenario that I'd been through in losing Jess, and that was a really important way for me to embrace it in a way, I suppose. I mean, I talk about it with my mum a lot, obviously, and she sort of quipped one day. She said sort of, you can explore this through a project sort of thing, and that got me thinking. How can I use my creativity and my photography to understand what's going inside here, and how can I ask questions through that and try and portray that in a way to the world through photographs in which people can sort of read and understand for themselves. So it's an extremely important sort of methodology, I suppose, for me to be able to come and sort of use my experiences of loss to pose those questions and ask questions of other people, but try and understand what's going on with me a bit more as well.
Thanks, Simon. One thing that really interests me is a connection I see between your work and Clover's. So Simon, in your work, people return to a site of an old photograph and restage that photograph. And as you say, there's something about going back to a familiar place with memories that connects you with the person who's died, but also helps you to kind of integrate the fact that they're no longer here. And Clover, in your books, there's, I know that you return to your childhood home at, very late. It's a sort of really difficult thing to do for you. But also there's something in your books where you crave a real intensity of experience. that you talk about it in terms of breaking wild horses, which you do, and also childbirth, where there are these amazing moments, and I think the term you use is almost crystallized, where the past disappears, the future disappears, you're only totally in the present tense, which you would think would wipe away your mother. But it's actually at these moments that you felt a connection with her. And I wonder if you could just say a little bit about that and reflect on that.
Well, after Mum's accident, my family, I'm a big, loving family. I'm the youngest of 5, and it had a really cataclysmic effect on our lives. And my family was essentially destroyed by it. It wasn't destroyed, but it was completely altered, and we were all traumatized. And I think as a teenager, me and Nell, who died, was 2 years older than me. So we were going through this together. We were living at home basically on our own because our dad was away working, and so there was sort of a high degree of trauma and loss. And I dealt with that by going out into the world, and I grew up with horses, so it was very natural for me to want to go and horses were a way of, in a really animal way of connecting with pain, not in a kind of, I sort of sought out, wild horses, I suppose. I went off and I lived in Texas, and I did rodeo, and I rode in Russia in very sort of dangerous circumstances. I definitely was taking myself into places of peril, I think, and trying to kind of find and face what happened to Mum in some way, because her losing someone who is still there, carrying that grief forward. I didn't really know how to. That was a really different thing from what I've been experiencing with Nell. Is that sort of ongoing sense of loss, and for me, that thing of being able to be somebody slightly different, I suppose, as well, of not having to take your story with you all of the time, because what happened to Mum was kind of moulding everything that I did. And as a young woman in my 20s, I often wanted to escape it as well. And Mum was there in nursing homes. I'd have to go and see her, and it was incredibly painful. And you carried grief as well as guilt, a lot of guilt about it. And that sense of the physical is a place of, for me, has been a place of complete escape and also finding. And the thing that I find interesting now is that as a young woman, I went off and I put myself into sort of dangerous circumstances. I travelled in quite a reckless way. I had a lot of reckless sex, drugs. I wanted to put myself into dangerous places, because I think that what had happened to me, the trauma inside me, meant that a place of kind of peril was a place that was familiar, actually, and that it was, it was kind of a relief. And actually in 2017, my husband had a really, really bad accident in a terrorist scare and broke both his legs very, very badly, nearly lost his legs. He was nearly paralysed. He is all right now. But when it happened, I had a newborn baby, and I was writing a book, and I just kind of knew what to do. I felt, people said to me, it must be so awful for you. And actually for me, it felt quite familiar. It almost felt like home. I kind of know how to function in that sort of high alert atmosphere. And I suppose taking yourself into a place of extreme physicality, whether that's memory of going back to a place that you love and there's like an extreme poignancy of the loss of that person, taking myself now back to places I went with my sister, and I write about this in my new book, is like taking myself to particularly, there's a wood that we used to go to as children and played in, and I've taken myself there, and I honestly felt as though I was in a kind of vortex, actually, a sort of out-of-body vortex of loss and pain and longing. And yet it is a way of connecting as well. In a way, the kind of easy, soothing domestic life is the bit that I find hardest, I think. I like re-feeling the losses because it takes me closer to the people that I'm longing for. It takes me closer to Nell, particularly because her loss is so recent. You know, it was only at the end of 2019, so I'm still in the early stages of grief with it. But I think that kind of the intense physicality is a way of feeling connected. How, even though it's painful, you know, I'm not trying to avoid the pain. I'm trying to feel the pain, because in the pain I feel my connection to her.
That's amazing. That's really powerful. And one of the things I love about reading your first book and then your second book is that your first book has these, you know, incredibly dramatic stories of traveling, of breaking horses, you know, Russia, Texas, all over the place. And, you know, it's an amazing adventure. But actually, your book on motherhood and the kind of domestic life is full of the same level of intensity. And I think one of the things you do as a writer is you show the kind of savagery of feeling behind the everyday, that actually being a mum, just what looks to the outside world quite dull, actually has this, you know, incredible love, frustration, fury, anger. So I think, you know, you show that, you know, it's not just about the kind of vividness of the narrative, but actually how you inhabit it that gives it its power.
I'm really pleased that you say that, because when I wrote the second book, I really wanted to communicate the fact that being a parent, I was writing it from the perspective of a mother, obviously, but being a parent is a very, very extreme process, and the kind of bravery and the resilience and the kind of personal attributes that it takes to bring your kids up is every bit as, you know, requires every bit as much kind of bravery as traveling off around the world is a breeze compared to bringing up children. It's much easier. It's much easier, and I think that's why I say I'm kind of grateful for the grief, because I do think that grief has given me an ability to re-feel my emotions and then communicate my emotions. I think that the fact of having lived them so deeply, and, you know, all of us three have, I think it is very, very interesting that this happened to us all when we were in our teenage life. It becomes utterly part of you, and I'm sure that, you know, you two know that feeling that you can't separate yourself from it at all. And for me, the joy of creativity as I get older is understanding it a bit more and being able to, you know, I can't go off traveling. Well, nobody can go off traveling around the world now, actually, but I can't. But I can kind of take myself to incredibly exciting, incredibly satisfying, incredibly painful, but incredibly interesting places when I'm in my writing. And I'm really eternally grateful for that. Writing this new book about Nell's death and how I experienced the aftermath has been really, really hard. And I've written it in this bedroom here, you know, behind this green wallpaper, but I have been into a whole world of kind of loss and love and deep, painful, beautiful feeling whilst writing it, and I'm very grateful for that.
Thank you. I've just had a glance at some of the questions that have come in, and there's one that asks, how do you control your own emotions when helping others? And I think this probably is for you, Stuart, although it may also link to some of your work, Simon. Stuart, can I ask you that? How do you control your own emotions when you are helping others?
It's hard. Especially when maybe you hear like even like listening to everyone speak today. That's hard because there's so many scenarios. I can see Simon sort of nodding. We both are nodding when Clover speaks because there's so many similarities that friend you just go, oh yeah, I get that, and that's again why we're trying to use our experiences. I think to communicate that to others, to say it's okay. It's okay to have dark days. It's okay to have days where you're happy. It's okay to, you know, days where you feel like you don't want to communicate with, and days where you do want to communicate with people. That's all part of the process. So for me, I say to it all the time, it's the day that I'm feeling, it's the moment I'm feeling, whether how I express and how I talk to someone about their own personal grief or feelings that they're going through. Especially in the younger setting as well. Like when I go around and speak to kids in different schools and things now, and especially when teachers say to me, oh, this young person experienced losing a sibling or has been going through some of their own personal grief, I can straight away see and understand something within them. And even if what I feel there is if I can just tell them one little thing that's going to make that journey for them a little bit easier, then I feel like that I have to do that. I have to find some way to express that to them, that whatever they're feeling going through right now is personal to them, but tomorrow they may feel different, and the day after that they'll feel different. And we all talk about this ride of emotion that you're going through, because it is a roller coaster. It is a roller coaster. There's going to be some days you're just going to hum along and go nice along like that. And there's other days it's going to be so erratic with your feelings. And when you are feeling that erraticness, it's just to understand that that's part of the process, which is really hard to do when you're going through it. But I think if there's ways that we, again, share, talk about, take photographs, all we're doing is explaining and helping people go through what they're going through and saying it's okay, because tomorrow might be completely different, and hopefully it will be different as well for you.
That makes sense. In some ways, it's sort of the benefit and the price of empathy, that you can connect to people, but the very way that you
100%.
connect to people is painful. So it sort of takes that sort of extra layer of protection off. Simon, what about you? Because you've obviously worked collaboratively.
Yeah, I mean, what I do is sort of encourage people to dig into the emotions. I'm stirring stuff up really, and people come to me to take part in that. I'm not putting them on the spot necessarily, but there is that level of empathy because I share what I've been through and they share what they've been through, and I've definitely been on shoots and doing interviews where we've both been crying and it's taken us by surprise, but that's okay. And I think the nature of what a lot of us, all of us are doing in a way is digging into that emotion, either to create something, to tell a story, or to share an experience, or to make a change. And I think that, for all of us, there's a point at which you suddenly feel, not suddenly, but, get to a point where you feel okay to look back and dig into those emotions, and not necessarily just to make yourself upset or angry or whatever it is, but to try and draw something out of that, to sort of, it does to reframe things and to reprioritize things. I was interested in the question actually, in terms of controlling emotion. It's obviously in certain circumstances you do need to be under an element of control yourself if you need to work or engage in relationships and that sort of thing. But I wouldn't. We are quite stoic. We are quite we can be quite withdrawn, and actually. Trying to put a lid on things isn't necessarily what I would try and encourage with anybody that I'm working with or having a conversation with. We need to give each other permission to talk about these things and to engage with the emotions that are involved. As Stuart says, you can feel different things on different days, but I went back to when my mum moved out of the house that we all grew up in. I went back to help her move out, and that was the day that I probably felt almost closest to my dad in a really tangibly emotional sense, because the whole place was filled with emotions and stories, and my whole childhood, and connected with my sister as well. And I really couldn't control my emotions that day. I sort of shut down in the morning, and I just had to sort of get on with some packing away jobs. And in the afternoon, I was just a mess, and I just had to let it out somehow. That was 6 or 7 years on from losing dad, maybe even longer. And there's obviously all this stuff that has sort of built up inside over the years, and you try and think, I'm having conversations about it and I'm feeling better about it after a certain amount of time, but actually that it's still in there, and I need that it almost caught me by it did catch me by surprise, but it felt so good to as Clover was saying, to sort of get close to that emotion and really feel it, and sort of know that I was feeling closer to dad because I was having that response and being in that place and having that emotional reaction. So obviously within my work it's about building empathy and making sure that we can try and tell a story and have a platform to share those things, but I think controlling your emotions has to be sort of something that each individual appreciates they sometimes have to do, but also gives themselves permission to embrace the emotions when they can.
That makes sense. I think that's a really important point that gets to the heart of it, that in fact, a lot of these projects aren't about controlling emotion. It's about feeling emotion and perhaps channeling emotion into something that we think is meaningful and has purpose. So, yeah, which seems like a very different thing to, that it's not a one-way situation. Simon, can I also just ask you, because you do these collaborative projects, but then you also have the photography you do completely on your own. And I just wonder if that's a different experience.
Yeah, it absolutely is, because I'm sort of looking in, I suppose, to a greater degree in terms of trying to project sort of personal emotions into imagery and try and portray something of myself, as opposed to the sort of narrative, more storytelling based work with other people. I think it's probably only in the more recent years that I've been able to reflect and appreciate that that's what I've been doing. I think I probably just thought I was just going out to take pictures, which is what a photographer does. But actually, you can do that in terms of a commission, or you can do that within a sort of a self-initiated project brief. But I will go out and just take pictures for myself. And it's only when I look back at those pictures I can appreciate what I'm seeing. Somebody else would be on the same walk as me with the same camera, but take completely different pictures, and they're seeing something different, but they would be reflecting in a different way. So there's an element of projecting emotion onto the pictures you've taken, but actually, especially after losing my sister, I only really felt like I could take these really sort of dark black and white pictures that I don't know if anybody else would ever be really interested in, but it was just very, very mundane stuff, like, the mud on the ground, or a fence that felt like I was being hemmed in, and there's lots of metaphor involved in that, but it's a very different experience to engaging with somebody else in order to try and sort of tell a story or share their perspective on things, I suppose.
That makes sense. It makes me want to ask you, Clover, some related questions really about creativity, because there's something about the raw experiences themselves, and then the way in which you need to shape them into a narrative for a story. And, so there is something that changes, those raw emotions, possibly falsifies aspects of your life just by giving them a narrative structure. And I just wonder about, that aspect of writing.
Well, it's a really interesting question, that, actually, because obviously, my books are my version of what happened, and they are my truths. But my, other people who lived through the same thing, my other siblings, are going to have different takes on what happened because they were living their lives. This is my lived experience. And when you create a book, you obviously put a beginning and a middle and an end around, you put a story around it, and it is very false. And actually, after I wrote The Wild Other, and that's about this big journey through grief and trauma that I went on with my mum, and at the end of it, I'm pregnant with my 5th child, and people said to me afterwards, oh, it's so, I'm so happy that you're happy now, and that everything is sorted out, and that you've kind of gone through this. But of course, that was my life. It didn't feel as though anything had ended. Yeah, people were saying it's so lovely you've got a happy ending, but I didn't feel happy, and it wasn't an ending, just because I'd written the book. And I actually found it really, really difficult after the first book was published, to realise that the book was something separate from my experience as well, and my pain was going to go on. It wasn't ending with the end of the book. And people often ask about writing being a cathartic experience, and it I do not think it is cathartic and creativity in the way that it kind of processes your emotions, ties them up into a neat little package, and then sends them on their way. It pulls the emotions up, and it kind of like leaves them bubbling there like a big cauldron, and that's it's painful. So it's essential for me to write. I realise it is more and more essential for me as I get older. I'm in my mid-40s, to go on creating. But there is it doesn't stop the pain, I suppose. And I think for me, understanding that pain is like an ongoing process, and as we've said, it does change. There are good days and bad days, and I'm not in a state of like acute pain all the time, but knowing that kind of something inside you is changed forever, and that is part of the process, and so the story element is quite odd. It is quite odd, and I'm getting to the end of this book that I'm writing about my sister's death, and obviously the book has to end, so but my feelings go forward, and so there is an element, I suppose, of artifice around it. But then I think the thing of we're talking about how do you control the emotions, and I think that's what's so exciting about creativity, is that it gives you a vehicle and a reason to feel the emotions, to control them, to turn them into something different. And it is, I'm really interested by Instagram. I use my Instagram a lot as a way of communicating with people and trying out ideas, and I try and use it really creatively. And I love talking to people on there, and people saying, it's such a relief to hear you articulating this pain, or it's such a relief to hear you identifying this pain, because I've been feeling, I've had a strange feeling. I've been feeling something that I didn't understand, or I haven't been feeling something, and now, having read your work, I am now feeling it, and that is a relief. So that's the sort of obviously there's the artificial element of it being contained within a narrative, but hopefully the creativity around it is an ongoing, limitless, boundless energy and source, I suppose, really. So yeah, that's that. I think the story element is quite odd, but knowing that what you're doing will go on living inside you. The creative force is always there. Is the kind of thing that I sort of hold on to, because I do feel quite odd finishing this book about my sister, because I will never finish a story about my sister,
And it's so, I think that makes perfect sense. And I love the way you put it. I think your books work so well because they contain so much raw emotion, and you do feel that we're getting very close to your lived experience. And yet they also work as a story. So it's that sort of, as a kind of reader who has certain expectations, they come in a really satisfying package, and somehow you manage to do both. But they feel very immediate and visceral when you read them. And I think for a lot of people, probably around motherhood in particular, there's shame around feeling intense emotion. The same is true for grief. The complexity of emotion, the wanting to get rid of grief, and actually having someone articulate it powerfully can also make people realize that they're not alone, that these emotions are shared by other people, and that it almost gives them a vocabulary that helps them to understand their feelings.
Yeah, and a sort of understanding of to not be afraid. Sometimes I feel my writing really, really hurts me when I do it, and I quite often sit here crying while I'm doing it. And in a way, sometimes I think that re-feeling it is like putting your hand into a fire, or swimming in extremely ice water or something. It hurts. It really damn well hurts. But that hopefully gives the writing its power, and that's what connects it with other people. And the thing of sharing your stories just feels like the most kind of deeply humane thing that we can do, really. To listen to other people's stories. I absolutely love Instagram because it enables me to talk to other people, just people all around the world who want to talk about the stuff that they're going through, and that feels like a massive, massive, massive privilege as a writer, as a human being, to be able to kind of, say that we're part of something together. We're all different. We're all living our own lives, but our the kind of things that hurt us, I suppose, are. There's a lot of commonality as well, and that humanity, I think, is really, for me, is really when you're in a state of grief, you're showing your broken self in a way. It's not the kind of together face that you're presenting to the world when you're trying to show that you're on your case and getting things done. And I think that to feel like you can do that, and that you're in a kind of space where you're able to do that, and whatever that is through, whether it is through activism or teaching or creativity, photography, finding a vehicle for it seems to me to be like a really, really important, part of this process, because otherwise you are kind of like, you're that feeling of lostness. You must both know this feeling as well, that like, what do I do? I remember after Mum died thinking, how do I what do I do to honour her? What do I do to manifest what I'm feeling? This is really, really big feeling. And I wanted to I remember saying if you were a Viking, you would send like a ship out in, you want to send a flaming ship out into the middle of the ocean. That's sort of what you want to do, isn't it? And if massive. And if you can find, something that enables you to do your version of that, then that is kind of, that's been a big driving force for me in the last few years.
This links directly into a question that we've had from the audience, which, maybe slightly intimidated by all the things that you all have done. They want to know some simple things they can do to find meaning that you can kind of fit into your everyday. Stuart, do you want to come in on this one?
Yeah, sure. That's anything though, isn't it? I never started off where I am today. Like it took a baby step into me, deciding to go to school the next day, deciding I was going to do my GCSEs, decided I was going to carry on. And like I said, along that journey, I stumbled, I fell over, I didn't quite make it. My GCSEs weren't the best, so I had to go redo those. I didn't finish my first year of university, so I had to go. So for me, I say to people, it's about going back to the whole thing about anger, how that's a catalyst to something. Where you take that next is up to you. So it can be creatively. You can start writing something down. So I wrote extensively during the case at the Old Bailey. That I felt that quite cathartic. I want to go into more creative things now. I want to make TV programs and animations to talk to young people about things in a different language. So it's how you see yourself and how you want to see others. I think that's what you should do. And looking at other people's examples can be, again, catalyst to start something, but it doesn't mean you have to write or you have to take pictures or you have to go out there and speak to other young people about things. It can be those things, but there's so many other ways for you to honour, to reflect, to highlight, to be at that centre of one with the person that you've lost. So I say, look at that first. Look at what makes you happy. Think about a situation or scenario that made you both happy and start from there.
Lovely. Simon, do you want to come in?
Just really quickly, I would say that sort of notion is about engaging as opposed to succeeding with something. So it, as Stuart says, it can be really basic day-to-day stuff. It's like making, your favourite meal that the person you've lost used to love eating, or going to a certain place. Me and my dad would sort of pick up like rocks on a walk, and that's a really basic thing to do. But now if I now pick up a rock on a walk, I have it in my pocket. It's tangible. It's tactile. It doesn't matter to anybody else, but it's a way of me engaging and connecting with the memory of Dad. And so it's just about those small proactive decisions. It doesn't have to be a grand creative thing, but I mean, in a similar way, I never thought that I would be making a photography project that would end up on TV and stuff. I just took a picture of Mum to restage of Dad because I wanted to see what it felt like and engage with that process. So start somewhere and don't put pressure on yourself to make it this huge thing, but just do lots of small things and see how it feels.
That's great. Clover, do you want to add anything to that?
I think I completely agree with all of those ideas, totally. And also I think like listening to other people and sharing your stories with other people. I found this event really, really moving, and like being able to share my story with you both has been really incredible, and it makes me feel sad, and it makes me feel connected to you, and it makes me feel sort of connected to something bigger. And I think that thing of sort of listening to other people as well, and when you know that somebody is lost, listening to their story, letting somebody talk about the person that they've lost or the feelings that they've gone through, and letting them kind of be present with it. So I think that sort of seeking out human connections, I suppose, for me has been a really, that's what helps me through this process and makes me feel that it's more and more valuable and profound and beautiful as well. You know, the human connections are what are really, really beautiful.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, that's really
brilliant.
important. And I think just from my own chats with Julia Samuel, you know, there's also little things you could do. Simon's project, which is about restaging a photo, you know, people at home can do that themselves. I think even wearing somebody's clothes, somebody who's died, you know, anything you can do. And you can also think to yourself, what were some of the things I wished I'd done with this person? And can I do them in my own life? Or what parts of their personality do I really love and value? And how can I make them part of me and take them into the world? So again, it's kind of going back to some of what Clover said about grief inhabiting you and, you know, becoming part of you, but also taking those people we love with us somehow.
Yeah.
I'm looking at the clock, and it looks to me that we are out of time. We didn't get to all the questions. I wanted to not just say thank you. Do you want to say how people can follow you after the festival and find you? Clover, do you want to say first you're on Instagram?
Yeah, in my Instagram, it's clover.stroud. I am on Twitter, but I don't like Twitter. I hate the sort of arguments. I don't like it at all. Whereas I love Instagram. I write about grief a lot. I write about joy and other stuff as well a lot. But I do. I find it's a great place to communicate with people. So if anybody, if anybody wants to talk more, have any more conversation about any of this, I'm always there.
Brilliant. And Stuart, I think we can find you, and Simon, you're online on Twitter and elsewhere. I'm being told we have to wrap up now. So final thought, if you're a mom out there, please do pick up Clover's latest book. It's very real, and if you're not a mom, read about this before you become a mom. So thank you so much. I found your stories incredibly powerful, and I really appreciate you sharing your wisdom and your insight and your story. So thanks to everybody, and bye for now.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.